And after all, it is the background against which we see everything. And even a blind person has a sense of space in that which does not obstruct motion. And yet, funny thing about space is that in a way it doesn't end where a solid begins. You can shift a solid around in space without apparently altering it in any way. And after all, there is space between the two sides, shall we say, or ends of the solid. We can think of that in terms of space and measure it in terms of space. But it is against space that we experience everything that we experience. And by the way, also, we experience everything not only in the dimension of space, but also in the dimension of time. And the fascination about space and time is that while they are basic to all possible experiences that we have, you just can't put your finger on them. Space seems to be completely immaterial. And when St. Augustine was asked what is time, he said, I know what it is, but when you ask me, I don't. So these two basic dimensions of our physical world are uncommonly elusive. We could perhaps say that they are pure abstractions. There is no such thing as space, and there is no such thing as time. They are merely our way of measuring and thinking about the behavior of the physical universe as a pattern, a system of patterns, energy patterns. And if you measure the movement of these patterns, the line along which you measure motion is called the timeline. If you measure their positions, the line along which you measure their positions you would call the space line. And these two lines would be as abstract as the equator in relation to longitude 0. These things don't exist on the physical face of the world. They are imaginary lines and are only to be found on maps. Could you also say that the same thing was true of time and space? We think, for example, that there are 3 coordinates of space and 1 of time. The 3 coordinates of space being length, breadth, and depth. And through that runs 1 of time. But come to think of it, it's rather artificial. It is making us think of space as having a sort of grain to it, as if it were a crystalline substance, and however transparent the crystal, it does have a grain. And space has the grain of up, across, and through. Those are the 3 ways in which we think of space. And we can't think of any more. Not with our senses. We can mathematically conceive spaces with infinitely many dimensions. That is to say, you can write it down as if it were so, but you can't conceive it in your imagination. You can draw, it's great fun to draw, a 4-dimensional cube having 4 spatial dimensions. It's called a tesseract. And tesseract is a good word to apply to a person who is ultimately square. 4-dimensional square. But the tesseract, you see the minute you draw it. that obviously you can't have more than the three right angular dimensions of space, or the coordinates, in any kind of solid figure that you know. And so you can think about it in terms of mathematics, but you can't conceive more than these three coordinates sensuously. And so we begin, it's basic common sense to us that space has this structure. But of course, the question is this a structure of space, or is it a structure of the human nervous system, the human brain, and human thought, which is projected onto the external world as a tool for measuring it? This is one way of approaching the problem. But there's another way altogether, which is to consider space as anything but nothing. If space is basic to all that we experience, as time is, you might say then that space is as near as we can imagine to being the ground of the world, or what some people have called God. The texts of the Hindus, Buddhists, and Taoists are full of ways in which the symbol of space is used to mean the ultimate reality. Space is used in basic Indian philosophy, in Vedanta. It is called Akasha. And Akasha is for them the fundamental element. There are 5 elements: earth, water, air, and fire, and Akasha. And so space contains all the other elements. In Buddhist philosophy, where the ultimate reality is called Shunyata, the void, the Chinese will translate the Sanskrit Shunyata with their character that means sky or space. And the Taoists would say, quoting Lao Tzu, the usefulness of a window is not so much in the frame as in the empty space through which something can be seen. The usefulness of a vase is not so much in the sides made of clay as in the hollow inside into which something can be put. And of course that is a startling metaphor for a Westerner, because we think the other way round, you see. As I started out to say, we really think commonsensically that space is nothing at all. And we are much more sympathetic to the idea that it's pure abstraction than to the Oriental idea that space has some kind of basic reality. It bothers us, too, when astronomers talk about curved space. How can nothing be curved? Or properties of space? Or expanding space? How can it do that? And then when architects begin to talk about the functions of spaces, the commonsensical Westerner thinks, why don't they talk about the functions of walls? Of course, the walls enclose spaces, but the spaces of themselves have no function. And they're bothered about this. Painters also are very aware of space, because especially if you paint in oils, you have to paint your background. And therefore, in filling it in, you begin to realize that it has its own shape. It is the obverse of the foreground. And when you play with photographic negatives, or anything that switches foreground to background, you begin to become aware of space as having a shape. the interval between all sorts of objects becomes for you something significant, even though it's constantly flowing and changing, as indeed are the objects within the space. So it is a kind of a bit of a shock to our common sense, which in most cases has not caught up with 20th century physics or astronomy, to hear space considered as something effective, as something definitely there, so that you could say it has properties. Take another case of space which is rather startling. There are different kinds of space. Space is basically, isn't it, an interval. There is an interval between each one of us sitting here. If we didn't have that, we would suffocate by being packed together like sardines. We need space in order to function as a human being. We need a kind of area in which to gesture and move and walk about and breathe and express ourselves. Now, you can have intervals not only in space but in time. Pauses are intervals. You can also have intervals in sound, the intervals between tones or notes. And the interesting thing about the intervals between tones is that they are that upon which the hearing of melody depends. Melody is to hear melody is to hear.
Only way mechanism will open many doors within your consciousness and begin to rejoin the many divisions and segments that you chop your consciousness up to represent. So therefore, one of the suggestions that we have made in our interaction with your science, and to put it quite colloquially, is when something is occurring to you, or shall we say within your reality, and you are labeling that it is happening to you. Why is this happening for me? This is no fair. What did I do to deserve this? That is a label. That is an attitude. That is a perspective. And when you make that assignment, that is the effect. However, there is another way to it. And this way enables you to utilize even that creation you say you do not prefer. And the simple statement that will represent the beginnings of allowing yourself to see this is, rather than why me, why poor little old me, ascribing the statement, all right, I understand the negative aspects about this, but I also understand that all symbols contain both. Therefore, how does this creation, how does this symbol serve me exactly the way it is? That simple perspective will at least allow you to begin to use that creation. And you will find that when you nail down positive reasons for any creation in this planet, symbols and events and objects of situation are merely messages from yourself to yourself. When you ascribe it in a negative way, you remove it from yourself, and therefore perhaps are not getting the positive message from the symbol. So very often the result of that symbol will be, it will come back perhaps in slightly different timing, slightly different form. From its perspective, to allow you the opportunity to get a particular message which aids very greatly in the growth and expansion of consciousness. So therefore, understanding you can begin to be a bit more conscious about it and begin to look at how it works. Or when you get the message that you created the symbol to represent it, they're no longer inconvenient for it. There is simply nothing extraneous in creation. If something exists, it exists. And then by definition, it is not extraneous. It is not that everything fits in my life except this. This is therefore, when asking yourself, how does this serve me? And going one step further to ask, how does it serve me exactly as it already is? If you will be honest, you will always find something. And when you nail down the overwhelming reason for the creation of that symbol, it simply transforms, changes face. So therefore, if there is something in your life that you feel is repetitive to you, that you do not prefer, first of all, we can assume you have been assigning it either the same or a similar negative label. So first of all, do not continue, if you wish, to do that. But when you are willing to act as an owner, so to speak, of your own reality, you would only assume that everything that you have created, if you truly believed you created your own reality, can be of service in a positive way. So therefore, by only being willing to look at what the positive perspective is, you allow it to transform and take a belief which was formerly unconscious, and by bringing it to the front, bringing it right in front of your face, literally, you allow it to transform. You allow it to become conscious. And because we are discussing this and the notion arises that you can continue to create your reality, at least from this moment forward, consciously, you will not continue to create unpreferential symbols. You will continue to now generate a positive momentum. However, those thoughts, those beliefs which resulted in unconscious beliefs will come up. They will allow you the opportunity to integrate them. So at first, when embarking upon a path such as this, sometimes it may seem that things are more negative at first, but the reason for this is it allows you the opportunity to take each of these ideas and make them conscious and decide whether you wish to transform it, and then if you do, transform it. So therefore, as you transform one thing at a time, rather than saying, this stinks, putting it back in the closet so it can come back nastier and uglier, you begin to clean out the very closet you have created. So it is not that you will need to go on for the rest of your life relabeling things you do not prefer and in a sense seeming to fool yourself into enjoying your reality. No. As you do allow these symbols to come up, transform and integrate them within you, and no longer continue to unconsciously create new beliefs, you knock them off, so to speak, or transform them in or integrate them one by one. And eventually, you get to the end. When you get to the end and have been for that period only generating your reality consciously, you then can experience only positive effects.
The of a vase is not so much in the sides made of clay as in the hollow inside into which something can be put. And of course that is a startling metaphor for a Westerner, because we think the other way round, you see. As I started out to say, we really, and after all there is space between the two sides, shall we say, or ends of the solid. We can think of that in terms of space and measure it in terms of space. But it is against space that we experience everything that we experience. And by the way also, we experience everything not only in the dimension of space, but also in the dimension of time. And the fascination about space and time is that while they are basic to all possible experiences that we have, you just can't put your finger on them. Space seems to be completely immaterial. And when St. Augustine was asked what is time, he said, I know what it is, but when you ask me, I don't. So these two basic dimensions of our physical world are uncommonly elusive. We could perhaps say that they are pure abstractions There is no such thing as space, and there is such thing as space, and there is no such thing as time. They are merely our space. So it is a kind of a bit of a shock to our common sense, which in most cases has not caught up with 20th century physics or astronomy, to hear space considered as something effective, as something definitely there, so that you could say it has properties. Take another case of space, which is rather startling. There are different kinds of space. Space is basically, isn't it,
to lay down the template of how a person with a preferred belief would act, and simply act that way. That is what you do anyway with the old belief, though unconsciously. We are now beginning to speak about making it conscious, allowing it to be conscious, making the new determination, and consciously choosing to manifest the new idea. You will immediately notice that the actions of the preferred belief will differ from the actions you have been taking. So it'll be quite obvious in that regard that you will obviously get a different effect. But what your imagination is doing is showing you that you contain within you that preferred belief already. And that is why you can even project how a person would act who had it. And that means because you already contain it, you already are it in the moment you are conjuring it up, that it will be most effortless to simply act that way. When you stop yourself from the automatic behavior you sometimes label that you have, and give yourself an alternative, the alternative being that it is a reflection of the new preferred you, will most obviously seem more attractive. Therefore, it will be most effortless to do the new thing rather than the old. And if you will simply give yourself the advantage or the opportunity to see what that would be,